March 29th, 1974. A group of farmers in Shaanxi Province, China, are digging a well during a brutal drought that has left their fields cracked and their wells dry for months. Water is running out. Time is running out. And then, a few feet down, their shovels hit something that should not be there. Fragments of pottery. A stone face staring straight up out of the dirt. A hollow torso built from fired clay, sitting exactly where nothing but soil should be. For one long, disorienting moment, the farmers have no idea whether they have found a demon, a curse, or the answer to a 2,000-year-old mystery nobody even knew existed. They have no idea they have just broken through the roof of a secret so carefully hidden that not even local legend remembered it was there. Within days, archaeologists arrive. Within weeks, the world learns about an underground army of more than 8,000 life-size soldiers standing in battle formation beneath a hillside outside Xian, guarding the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China, who died in 210 BCE. For 50 years, that army has been treated as a triumph, a wonder of the ancient world, a masterpiece of craftsmanship displayed in museum halls and documentaries as proof of one man's staggering ambition. But in 2026, a wave of new scanning data, combined with decades of archaeological and genetic evidence that had been sitting quietly in unmarked pits a few kilometers away, forced researchers to ask a very different question. Not how the soldiers were built, what they were actually built to hide. And the answer is not comforting. Here's the detail that should unsettle you before we go any further. There's no warning anywhere in the historical record that this army existed. No ancient map, no temple inscription, no passed down family story pointing at that hillside. A project this enormous, this labor-intensive, involving a workforce historians estimate in the hundreds of thousands, vanished from human memory so completely that for over 2,000 years, nobody knew to look for it. That kind of silence does not happen by accident. Someone worked very hard to make sure it happened. Roughly a century after the emperor's death, a court historian named Sima Qian compiled the records of the Grand Historian, one of the most important surviving texts on early Chinese history. Sima Qian wrote about the emperor's mausoleum in obsessive, almost unsettling detail. He described a subterranean palace filled with models of rivers and seas made from flowing mercury. A ceiling inlaid with pearls to represent the night sky. Automatic crossbows rigged on hair-trigger mechanisms to fire on any grave robber who dared enter. And more than 700,000 laborers conscripted to build the entire complex. What Sima Qian never mentions, not once in any surviving passage, is the Terracotta Army itself. Not the soldiers, not the pits, not the horses or the chariots. For an achievement this staggering, that omission is genuinely strange. Either the army held a specific ritual significance so sensitive it could not be written down, or its true purpose was considered dangerous enough to erase entirely from the official record, even 100 years later when a passing mention should have been harmless. That gap between what stands in the ground and what the histories actually say about it is exactly where the mystery lives. For decades, researchers filled that gap by studying the soldiers themselves, their armor, their construction technique, the vivid paint that turned out to flake away and disintegrate within seconds of exposure to open air after 2,000 years sealed underground, a discovery so devastating in the 1970s that archaeologists have deliberately left most of the surrounding complex, including the emperor's actual burial chamber, completely unexcavated to this day. In the 1980s, when researchers opened a smaller subsidiary pit for the first time in decades, they watched colors that had survived for over 2,000 years peel away and vanish within seconds of contact with open air, an irreversible chemical reaction triggered by the sudden change in pressure and humidity. It happened too fast for anyone to stop it, and it happened on camera. That single incident is a large part of why the emperor's actual burial chamber has never been touched. What almost nobody looked at closely for a very long time was the workforce. The 700,000 pairs of hands Sima Qian mentioned almost as a footnote. The scale of the workforce itself is worth sitting with for a moment because the number is almost impossible to picture. Construction on the broader mausoleum complex reportedly began when the future emperor was just 13 years old, shortly after he inherited the throne of the state of Qin in 247 BCE, and continued for close to 38 years, spanning his violent unification of China's warring states in 221 BCE, and continuing even after his own death in 210 BCE. The workforce was never a single unified group. Historical and archaeological evidence points to skilled artisans, brought in specifically for their expertise in bronze casting, pottery, and construction, working alongside enormous numbers of conscripted commoners and convicted criminals sentenced to hard labor as punishment, all operating simultaneously across a sprawling administrative district built solely to house and manage them. The soldiers themselves were mass-produced using an early form of assembly line technique, with different workshops responsible for different body parts. Torsos, legs, arms, and heads were produced separately from molds, then individually customized, assembled, and fired, with final details added by hand. That process explains both how a project this size was physically achievable within a single human lifetime, and why, despite the mass production, no two faces ended up quite identical. None of this labor was voluntary in any meaningful sense. Conscription under Qin law was compulsory, backed by an infamously harsh legal code where failing to report for assigned labor, or simply arriving late, could itself result in severe punishment, up to and including execution. Workers were housed in dense temporary settlements built specifically for the project, fed on whatever rations the state deemed sufficient, and organized into rigid work units modeled closely on Qin military structure, complete with overseers responsible for meeting production quotas. If a quota went unmet, punishment could fall on the entire unit rather than only the individual who had fallen behind. This was, in other words, considerably less a construction site in any modern sense, and considerably closer to a militarized labor camp, operating continuously for the better part of 4 decades. That changed in 2003. Archaeologists working near the mausoleum complex, several kilometers from the pits containing the soldiers, uncovered something far less photogenic than an army of clay warriors, a cluster of unmarked graves containing human skeletal remains. Not formal burials. Researchers noted something specific and disturbing. Several of the skeletons had been buried with their legs twisted or bent at unnatural angles, a burial-style historical records associate with low status or dishonored deaths in the Qin dynasty. Some remains showed signs consistent with restraint, indications that individuals may have still been bound at the time they were placed in the ground. This lines up directly with Sima Qian's account of a workforce drawn from convicted criminals alongside ordinary conscripted commoners. Skeletal analysis told an even more direct story. Researchers documented healed fractures, joint stress, and skeletal wear patterns consistent with years of grueling, repetitive manual labor, layered with evidence of malnutrition, premature death, and, in a meaningful number of cases, trauma consistent with violence rather than exhaustion or illness. This was not a population that lived out full lifespans and died peacefully. This was a population worked hard, and in a documented number of cases, killed. Excavation expanded gradually in the years that followed, and the burial ground kept growing, in a pattern consistent with a workforce cycled through the project continuously across its nearly 4-decade construction timeline, rather than a single catastrophic event. Death here was not an isolated accident. It was a sustained, ongoing feature of the project. The next question was where these people actually came from, and that is where genetic research eventually stepped in. Ancient DNA, extracted from a sample of the excavated remains, was compared against population data from across the regions that had, by the time construction began, been absorbed into the newly unified Qin Empire. The genetic picture that emerged pointed toward a workforce pulled from a wide, diverse cross-section of the empire rather than a single local population, consistent with a centralized conscription system capable of moving laborers and convicts across enormous distances from their homes. This is exactly what the historical record describes, but for the first time, it was written into the bones themselves. These were not local farmers pressed into service near their own villages. Many had been forcibly relocated, sometimes hundreds of miles, to build a monument most of them would never see completed, for an emperor who had just spent decades violently unifying a set of independent warring states under his direct control. Researchers involved in this genetic work are careful to flag the technical difficulty of working with DNA this degraded and this old, and they stress that a sample of dozens of burials cannot, on its own, prove the fate of a workforce numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But the picture it paints, alongside the skeletal evidence, is consistent, coherent, and considerably darker than the story told in most museum placards. Now here is where the account gets genuinely disturbing, because buried in Sima Qian's description of the tomb's completion, sandwiched between the Mercury rivers and the crossbow traps, sits a passage historians have quoted for centuries with visible discomfort, precisely because of how casually it is written. According to the text, once the inner chambers were sealed and the emperor's body laid to rest, the ruling court grew concerned that the artisans and workers who had built the tomb's most secret inner mechanisms knew far too much about its treasures and its layout. So the middle gate was shut, and the outer gate was closed, sealing every remaining artisan and laborer inside, so that, in the historian's own words, not one came out. For a long time, many historians treated this passage with polite skepticism, the kind of dramatic flourish ancient chroniclers sometimes added for effect rather than a literal transcript of events. What the accumulated physical evidence increasingly suggests is that this passage deserves to be read far more literally than that skepticism allowed. The mass graves, the restraint marks, the pattern of premature violent death among a workforce pulled from across the empire specifically for this project. All of it aligns uncomfortably well with a workforce that was never simply dying at unusually high rates on a dangerous job. It looks like a workforce that was, at multiple points across the project's decades-long timeline, deliberately removed once its usefulness expired. There is a bitter irony sitting at the center of all this. The emperor who ordered this entire project spent enormous resources chasing his own immortality. He sent fleets of ships, carrying young men and women across the sea in search of a legendary island where a potion said to defeat death was supposedly kept. Those expeditions, led by a court alchemist named Shu Fu, never returned with what they promised, and some historians believe they were never meant to. Returning empty-handed would mean standing before the court and admitting the emperor was mortal after all, that the man who had unified an entire civilization under his personal will was still, underneath it all, just a man who was going to age and weaken and die like everyone who had ever lived before him. He spent his final years consuming substances his own advisors claimed would extend his life indefinitely, some of which almost certainly contained mercury, the very element his engineers were simultaneously pouring by the ton into the floor of his tomb to represent the rivers of his empire in permanent miniature. There is something almost darkly poetic in that detail. The same substance he may have swallowed to chase eternal life is the substance that now makes his tomb too dangerous for anyone to open. And, in the end, the single mechanism that protected his secrets most effectively for the next 2,000 years was not any crossbow trap or river of poison. It was simply making sure the people who actually knew the details never had the chance to tell anyone. This brings us to 2026, and to the reason this story is back in the news at all. Explorer and engineer Albert Lin, known for combining high-resolution scanning technology with field archaeology on projects searching for lost tombs and hidden structures around the world, was reported to have reviewed a new set of subsurface scans collected near the mausoleum complex in Xian. Footage and claims tied to Lin's name spread rapidly across social media in early 2026, describing ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR sweeps that allegedly revealed sealed vertical shafts, dense clusters of unidentified buried objects, and even a hidden pyramid-shaped structure packed directly beneath the main burial mound, invisible from the surface. Some versions of the story go much further, describing a supposedly still unverified skeleton found in an isolated chamber with a bronze arrowhead lodged in the skull, framed online as a murdered prince from the emperor's own bloodline, silenced during the succession crisis that followed the emperor's death. It is worth being straightforward about where this story currently stands. As of now, there is no peer-reviewed publication and no statement from Chinese cultural heritage authorities confirming that Albert Lin conducted an authorized survey of the restricted core of the mausoleum, or that a royal skeleton bearing execution marks has been recovered from beneath the site. Some of the most dramatic claims circulating online, a supposed sealed convergence chamber, an underground structure that reportedly responded to the scanning pulses themselves, footage described as confiscated by officials, read like the language of speculative storytelling rather than a field report, and should be treated with real caution until an actual research institution puts its name behind them. China's central tomb chamber remains sealed, unexcavated, and tightly controlled, and drone flights over the protected zone have historically required government authorization that is rarely granted to foreign researchers, with every scan historically conducted under direct official supervision. The viral footage may be dramatized, misattributed, or simply premature. What is not exaggerated, and what makes the viral version of this story land so hard, is that almost everything underneath the sensational framing lines up with things that are already independently documented and genuinely unsettling on their own. It also helps to understand what the ancient accounts actually describe waiting inside that sealed chamber, because it is stranger than most people realize. Sima Qian's crossbow traps were not a single decorative flourish. They were described as mechanically rigged, hair-trigger devices positioned to fire automatically on anyone who breached the inner passageways without authorization. A real engineering feat for the 3rd century BCE, whether or not the wooden mechanisms themselves could still function after 2,000 years underground. Bronze trigger components recovered from other Qin-era sites confirm the underlying technology existed and was sophisticated enough to be taken seriously as a genuine deterrent, not merely a scare tactic recorded for dramatic effect. Start with the mercury. Real soil surveys conducted around the mound since the early 1980s, including a widely cited study published by Chinese geologist Duan Qingchang, measured mercury concentrations in the soil above the sealed tomb that are dramatically higher than anything that occurs naturally in the surrounding region, in some readings many times above background levels. That single fact, sitting quietly in the geological record for over 40 years, does something remarkable. It confirms the core of Sima Qian's 2,000-year-old account of underground rivers of mercury is not exaggeration or legend. It is documentation, hiding in plain sight in the chemistry of the ground itself. If the central chamber were ever opened, mercury vapor at concentrations consistent with what the soil data implies would be acutely toxic and could pose a serious hazard to anyone standing nearby before proper containment measures were in place. That is one of the primary reasons Chinese archaeologists have chosen, for now, not to touch the innermost chamber at all, alongside the well-documented preservation problem, painted surfaces, lacquered wood, and possibly silk textiles inside could begin degrading the moment fresh air reaches them, the same way the soldiers' vivid paint disintegrated within seconds back in the 1970s. Opening the tomb and destroying what it contains could, quite literally, happen in the same instant. There's also the matter of the treasure. The ancient scrolls and texts insist is still down there. Historical descriptions of the inner chamber mentioned gold, jewels, and ceremonial objects on a scale the ancient writers themselves struggled to fully capture in words, arranged around a scale model of the emperor's entire palace, with those mercury rivers built to flow endlessly through it. Whether or not any 21st century scan has actually detected the outline of that space, as some of the 2026 viral claims insist, the description itself is consistent with everything else we know about how obsessively this emperor tried to recreate his living empire underground, down to clay stables, sculpted animals, and functional bronze tools, so that if his dynasty ever collapsed above ground, his spirit would still command a complete and perfect version of it below. Then there is the sheer scale of what remains unexcavated. The pits open to the public and shown in photographs represent only a fraction of the full complex. Archaeologists have long estimated that thousands more figures and enormous sections of the surrounding necropolis remain buried and unexamined, stretching across an area covering many square kilometers around the central mound. Surveys using ground-penetrating radar and remote sensing over the past 2 decades, well before the 2026 viral footage, had already mapped buried walls, collapsed passages, and structures that do not appear on any existing architectural record, alongside the known stables, bronze workshops, and administrative quarters that supported the workforce during construction. Whether or not a specific pyramid-shaped chamber lies precisely where the recent viral claims place it, the broader picture, those decades of legitimate survey work paint, is of an underground world considerably larger and considerably stranger than what tourists see when they look down into the 3 excavated pits. And then there is the darkest confirmed chapter of the emperor's reign, one that sits alongside all of this like a warning label. In 213 and 212 BCE, official decrees ordered the mass burning of texts across the empire, targeting historical records, philosophical writings, and any material that offered a framework for imagining alternatives to the emperor's absolute rule. Sima Qian's history records that in the aftermath, over 460 scholars were rounded up and executed, buried alive, for the crime of holding ideas the emperor had not personally sanctioned. This was not a rumor added centuries later. It became one of the defining, most cited atrocities of the Qin dynasty, referenced repeatedly in subsequent Chinese historiography, as the moment the emperor's paranoia turned explicitly against intellectual dissent, rather than simply political rivals. Every person working on the tomb complex, from the humblest laborer to the most skilled craftsman, existed inside a legal system defined by that same paranoia, where an accusation from a colleague, a moment of hesitation, or an association with someone already under suspicion could be enough to end a life. The chain of suspicion extended outward with no obvious limit, and the people who worked closest to the tomb's most secret inner mechanisms carried the highest risk of all. It's worth pausing here to be fair to the evidence and to the people carefully studying it, because researchers working on the synthesis are the first to raise their own caveats. The excavated mass graves near the mausoleum, while genuinely significant, represent a small fraction of the workforce Sima Qian describes. Extrapolating a single empire-wide policy of deliberate, systematic execution from a geographically limited sample is exactly the kind of leap careful historians try to avoid. Sima Qian's account, however well it lines up with the physical evidence, remains a single textual source written a century after the fact, by an author working inside a literary tradition that sometimes favored dramatic moral narrative over strict documentary precision. And skeletal trauma consistent with violence cannot, by itself, distinguish cleanly between deliberate execution, brutal overwork, and disease outbreaks common to any large, densely packed labor camp in the ancient world. There is also the sober reality that the one place most likely to contain the clearest physical evidence of exactly what happened in the tomb's final days, the sealed innermost chamber itself, remains completely unopened, both for preservation reasons and out of respect for what is technically still an imperial burial site. Until, or unless, that chamber is ever opened using techniques capable of properly preserving whatever lies inside, a meaningful piece of this puzzle will likely stay permanently out of reach, no matter how confident researchers become about everything surrounding it. These caveats matter. They are the difference between a documentary and propaganda, and the researchers behind the strongest version of this story include them, rather than hide them. But even holding every one of those caveats in mind, the broader shape of what has emerged by pulling 5 decades of separate evidence together is difficult to look away from. The Terracotta Army has spent 50 years being presented to the public almost entirely as a triumph. A monument to craftsmanship, coordination, and imperial genius, the kind of achievement that earns its own museum wing and its own reverent narration. And in a narrow sense, that is true. It is a genuinely extraordinary feat of coordinated human effort. But sitting quietly a few kilometers away, largely unexamined by the public imagination for the first several decades after the soldiers themselves were unearthed, is the considerably less flattering other half of the same story. A workforce pulled from across a newly conquered empire, worked under brutal conditions that killed a meaningful number of them before the project was even finished, and then, according to increasingly well-supported evidence, silenced permanently the moment their usefulness ran out. That imbalance in attention is not unique to this one monument. Almost every ancient wonder the world celebrates, the pyramids, the temples, the palaces, the walls stretching for thousands of miles, carries some version of the same buried second story underneath its more marketable public narrative. An uncounted, largely unnamed labor force whose suffering rarely makes it onto the museum placard next to the object their hands actually built. What makes the Terracotta Army's version of this story unusually well documented and unusually hard to dismiss is simply how much physical evidence happened to survive close enough to the monument itself to eventually be found, examined, and decades later finally assembled into something close to a coherent account. There is something almost unbearably specific about the cruelty of it once you know the fuller version. Whoever these craftsmen were, and researchers now have a considerably clearer sense of where many of them came from and how they actually lived, they spent years building thousands of individually distinct human faces into fired clay. No two faces the same. Individual expressions, individual hairstyles, even individual tread patterns carved into the soles of sculpted shoes, for figures that were never meant to be seen again by any living person. That level of humanizing detail sits in stark, almost painful contrast to the complete anonymity of the graves these same workers were eventually given. They gave every single soldier in that underground army an identity. Nobody ever returned the favor. So, when the scans keep coming, when Albert Lin's name or someone else's shows up attached to the next dramatic claim about hidden chambers and buried treasure beneath the Emperor's mound, and there is every reason to think more of these claims are coming, it is worth remembering what the confirmed, independently verified evidence already tells us, without needing a single unverified viral clip to make the point. The mercury really is there, at concentrations that match a 2,000-year-old written account almost exactly. The mass graves really are there, a few kilometers from the tourist pits, filled with people whose bones tell a story of exhaustion, malnutrition, and, in a documented number of cases, violence. The book burning and the live burial of scholars really happened, recorded not as legend, but as history. And the gate really was, according to the Emperor's own court historian, sealed shut behind the very people who built it, so that not one of them came out again. Whatever new footage circulates next, whatever the next viral headline claims Albert Lin or anyone else discovered beneath that hillside, the actual documented history underneath the 8,000 silent, perfectly individual faces is already strange enough, already dark enough, and already sitting there waiting for anyone patient enough to read the sources instead of just the headline. The soldiers were built to stand guard for eternity. The people who built them were built to be forgotten. And it took 2,000 years, a handful of unmarked graves, and a considerable amount of slow, unglamorous science just to finally ask the right question on their behalf. What exactly was that army guarding all along, and who decided, 2,000 years ago, that the truth had to be buried right alongside the people who built it in the dark, where no scan, no historian, and no farmer digging a well would ever be able to find it again?